When I was researching my biography of Helen Keller, I thought I knew everything about her teacher, Anne Sullivan Macy. And then I found something that made me realize that all those years I'd been writing about Anne and talking about Anne to audiences around the world. To learn more about our upcoming programs and how you can support us, please visit our website. I got it wrong. I had failed Anne. It's a failure that historians have shared because in telling Helen's story over when she was 8 years old, Anne contracted a disease called retinopathy, which nearly killed her. This new stepmother, Elizabeth Lathrop, treated Anne like a member of the family. Laura was the first deafblind person in the United States to learn to read and write. She lost her sight and hearing as a young girl, and she entered the Perkins Institution at age 3, where she was taught by the renowned educator Samuel Gridley how, at the time, travel was dangerous for someone who was blind. So she convinced Laura to join her on an adventure through Europe, but her plans to get married were put on hold. When she was asked to teach a new student named Helen Adams Keller, she resisted Anne's attempts to communicate, and Anne felt desperate, but she refused to give up. Instead of punishing Helen for her behavior, Anne decided to understand Helen better. The two had met 2 years earlier and hit it off right away. They enjoyed talking about politics, art, and literature. Anne suffered from terrible headaches, probably as a result of the illness she had as a child. She was also deeply unhappy with her marriage. John was controlling and possessive, and he didn't like spending so much time with Helen. Because of his jealousy, Anne and Helen's relationship changed. If you enjoyed this program and would like to support us, please visit our website to learn more about upcoming programs, how you can support us, and more. Anne began to resent Helen for the time they could no longer spend together. And Helen felt rejected by Anne, who was once her best friend. John was supportive of Anne's work with Helen and was happy to help out in any way that he could. He told her that she couldn't get a divorce because she was legally blind. This was true, but it didn't matter. Anne was devastated. She had always considered herself a strong, independent woman, but now she felt trapped. In 1909, Anne took her own life. She watched Helen carefully and began to notice things about the way she responded to certain sounds and movements. She was the straightforward educational superhero who single-handedly reached the unruly child and turned her into a well-adjusted adult. The truth is that Anne's story is far more complex and interesting than that. She was a brilliant, creative, and determined woman who overcame incredible obstacles. She was also an innovator who developed new methods for teaching deaf-blind people. But most of all, she was a human being with hopes and dreams and fears and failures. Anne Sullivan Macy was not perfect, but she was remarkable. One day, Anne took Helen outside and began to spell the word water into Helen's hand. When Helen reached out to touch the water, Anne knew that she had made a breakthrough. From that moment on, Anne devoted her life to Helen's education and well-being. Helen had been ill as a baby and was left deaf. Now at age 6, she was out of control. No teacher could reach her. She threw tantrums, scratched, and bit anyone who came near her, and wouldn't speak. She was impulsive and unpredictable, and no one thought that she could ever be educated. Anne was scared, but she was also excited. This was a chance for her to prove that a deaf-blind child could succeed in school. And when Helen's mother, Kate, visited Perkins to meet Anne, the two of them quickly became friends. Kate encouraged Anne to get creative with Helen's education, and the two agreed that Anne would take Helen home to live with the family so that she could begin working with her right away. The two traveled extensively, staying in hotels, taking in the sights, and experiencing new foods. When they weren't traveling, they enjoyed taking long walks and talking for hours about philosophy, literature, and current events. There were times when she wanted to quit, but every time she thought about giving up, she heard the voice of her friend Laura Bridgman telling her that she could do it. Through Anne's work with Helen, she learned the importance of celebrating small victories and never underestimating the power of hope. Helen blossomed under Anne's guidance. She learned to read and write, and eventually she attended Radcliffe, where she earned a bachelor's degree. Helen went on to become a world traveler, author, and political activist. She used her platform to advocate for people with disabilities and for world peace. Most importantly, they talked about their hopes and dreams for the future. And one of Anne's dreams was to marry. When Anne arrived, Laura was already working as a teacher's assistant. Anne's biographer, Elizabeth B. Welsford, described Laura as looking at Anne with a critical eye as only a deaf-blind person could. Both girls struggled against the odds to make sense of a world that seemed determined to keep them from succeeding. They bonded immediately. They were close in age, and they understood each other in a way that neither had experienced before. In addition to sharing their struggles, they They also enjoyed a good laugh together. Anne said that Laura was the best whistler in the world, and that she loved to hear her imitate a locomotive or a steamboat, but she also expected her to behave like a servant, caring for younger children and helping out around the house. As they finished school, Laura went to work in the Perkins Library, while Anne was placed as a teacher in the little farm town of West New York. The two stayed in touch and often talked about the problems they faced as deaf-blind teachers. In those conversations, Anne would complain about her students and whether she was doing a good job. One day, Laura asked her friend if she really believed that she was doing poorly. Anne confessed that she did. Laura replied, "You don't think you are doing well because you expect too much of yourself. You have to high an ideal of what you ought to do. But why should you have such an ideal? You are doing better than any other teacher, either blind or seeing, in America." That conversation gave Anne confidence to continue teaching. Eventually, her father suggested that she be sent off to an institution for the education of the blind, which meant that Anne would be separated from her family. Not surprisingly, she hated the idea. In a letter to her friend Mary, she wrote, "My father said yesterday that I must go to the institution for the blind in Boston. That I must leave home and father, stepmother and brothers and sisters and friends. Oh, Mary, what shall I do? What shall I do?" Anne didn't know it at the time, but her time at the Perkins School for the Blind would change her life forever. She spent months blind and feverish in a dark room, but even when she regained her sight, she suffered the effects of the illness both physically and emotionally. She would have headaches and dizzy spells for the rest of her life. I am also one of the foremost authorities on Anne Sullivan Macy, Helen's teacher. I've been giving talks about Anne and Helen to audiences around the world for almost 20 years. And over again, we've painted it into a corner. We've created an image of an that is less than the sum of her parts, an image that doesn't do justice to a woman who broke down barriers, not just for Helen, but for herself and for other women. I want to introduce you to the real Anne Sullivan Macy. This program is part of a series. I am a historian and author of several books about Helen Keller, including a biography for young readers and adults. Anne Sullivan Macy was born in 1866 in Little Falls, Massachusetts. But there were other problems. Anne's mother died when she was 11, and soon after her father married one of his co-workers from the paper mill where he was a foreman. At Perkins, Anne met her new teacher, Miss Laura Bridgman. The two girls had different strengths. Anne was artistic and could draw and paint beautiful pictures. Laura was more practical. She was good at math and science, but being a teacher wasn't enough for Anne. She wanted to see the world. In 1887, Anne returned to Perkins as head of the new Department of Household Arts for the Blind. When Anne and Helen first met, Helen didn't want anything to do with her. It was a bumpy ride. Sometimes Anne felt like she was making progress with Helen, and sometimes she felt like she was back to square one. In 1904, Anne married John Macy, a writer and editor. By all accounts, Anne's life seemed to be a success. But behind closed doors, the picture was very different. Anne tried to end her marriage, but John refused to grant her a divorce. For the last 100 years, historians have told the story of Anne Sullivan Macy as the Helen Keller story. Thank you for watching this episode of the Author Talk series.